Good morning, welcome back. I last left you with a bad throat, and Holt and Will were talking. Will had just kind of moved into Holt's cottage, and he was explaining what the Rangers do. So, it says, King Herbert established the Corps at 50, one for each of the 50 fiefdoms. I'm based here, my colleagues are based at the other 49 castles throughout the kingdoms. In addition to providing intelligence about potential enemies, Rangers are the law keepers, said Holt. We patrol the fiefdom assigned to us and make sure that the laws are being obeyed. I thought Baron Errol did that, Will put in. Holt shook his head. The Baron is a judge, he said. People bring their complaints to him so he can settle them. Rangers enforce the law. We take the law out to the people. If a crime has been committed, we look for evidence. We're particularly suited to that role since people often don't realize we're around. We investigate to see who's responsible. What happens then? Will asked. Holt gave a small shrug. Sometimes we report back to the Baron of the Fife, and he'll have the person arrested and charged. Sometimes, if it's a matter of urgency, we just deal with it. What do we do? Will asked before he could stop himself. Holt gave him a long, considering look. Not too much if we've only been an apprentice for a few hours, he replied. Those of us who've been Rangers for 20 years or more tend to know what to do without asking. Oh, said Will, suitably chastened. Holt continued. Then in times of war, we act as special troops, guiding the armies, scouting before them, going behind enemy lines to cause the enemy grief, and so on. He glanced down at the boy. It's a bit more exciting than working on a farm. Will nodded. Perhaps life as a ranger's apprentice was going to have its appeal after all. What sort of enemies? He asked. After all, Castle Redmont had been at peace for as long as he could remember. Enemies from within and without, Holt told him. People like the Scandian Sea Raiders, or Morgarath and his Wargles. Will shivered, recalling some of the more lurid stories about Morgarath, the Lord of the Mountains of Rain and Night. Holt nodded somberly as he saw Will's reaction. Yes, he said, Morgarath and his Wargles are definitely people to be worried about. That's why the Rangers keep an eye on them. We like to know if they're gathering, if they're getting ready for war. Still, said Will, as much as to reassure himself as for any other reason, the last time they attacked the Baron's armies, the Baron's armies made mincemeat out of them. That's true, Holt agreed, but only because they'd been warned of the attack. He paused and looked meaningfully at Will. By a ranger? The boy asked. Correct. It was a ranger who brought word that Morgarath's Wargles were on their way, then led the cavalry across a secret ford so they could flank the enemy. It was a great victory, Will said. It certainly was, and all due to a ranger's alertness and skill, and knowledge of back trails and secret paths. My father died in that battle, Will added in a quieter voice, and Holt cast a curious look at him. Is that so? He said. He was a hero, a mighty knight, Will continued. The ranger paused, almost as if he were deciding whether to say something or not, and then he simply replied, I wasn't aware of that. Will was conscious of a sense of disappointment. For a moment, he had a feeling that Holt knew something about his father, that he could tell him the story of his heroic death. He shrugged to himself. That's why I was so keen on to go to battle school, he said finally, to follow in his footsteps. You have other talents, Holt told him, and Will remembered the Baron saying much the same thing to him the previous night. Holt, he said. The ranger nodded for him to continue. I was sort of wondering. The Baron said you chose me. Holt nodded again, saying nothing. And both of you say I have other qualities that make me suitable to be a ranger's apprentice? That's right, Holt said. Well, what are they? The ranger leaned back, linking his hands behind his head. You're agile? That's good in a ranger, he began. And as we've discussed, you can move quietly. That's very important. You're fast on your feet, and you're inquisitive. Inquisitive? How do you mean? Asked Will. Holt looked at him sternly. Always asking questions. Always wanting to know answers, he explained. That was why I had the Baron test you with that piece of paper. But when did you first notice me? I mean, when did you first think of selecting me? Will wanted to know. "Oh," said Holt, "I suppose it was when I watched you steal those cakes from Master Chubb's kitchen." Will's jaw dropped open with amazement. "You watched me? But that was ages ago." He had a sudden thought. "Where were you?" "In the kitchen," said Holt. "You were too busy to notice me when you came in." Will shook his head in wonder. He had been sure there was nobody in the kitchen. Then he remembered once again how Holt, wrapped in his cloak, could become virtually invisible. There was more to being a ranger, he realized, than how to cook and clean. "I was impressed with your skill," said Holt, "but there was one thing that impressed me far more." "What was that?" asked Will. "Later, when Master Chubb questioned you, I saw you hesitate. You were going to deny having stolen the cakes. Then I saw you admit it. Remember? He hit you on the head with his wooden spoon." Will grinned and rubbed his head thoughtfully. He could still hear the crack made by the spoon hitting his head. "I wondered if I shouldn't have lied," he admitted. Holt shook his head very slowly. "Oh, no, Will. If you'd lied, you never would have become my apprentice." He stood up and stretched, turning to go indoors to the stew simmering on the stove. "Now, let's eat," he said. Chapter 9. Horace dropped his pack on the floor of the dormitory and fell across his bed, groaning with relief. Every muscle in his body ached. He had no idea that he could feel so sore, so worn out. He had no idea that there were so many muscles in the human body that could feel this way. Not for the first time, he wondered if he was going to get through the 3 years of battle school training. He had been a cadet for less than a week, and already he was a total physical wreck. When he applied for battle school, Horace had a vague notion of glittering, armor-clad knights doing battle, while lesser folk stood by and watched in awed admiration. Quite a few of those lesser folk, in his mental picture, had been attractive girls. Jenny, his year-mate in the ward, had been a prominent young among them. To him, battle school had been a place of glamour and adventure, and battle school cadets were people that others looked up to and envied. The reality was something else. So far, battle school cadets were people who rose before dawn and spent the hour before breakfast doing a severe course of physical training. Running, lifting weights, standing in lines of 10 or more to lift and hold heavy logs over their heads. Exhausted by all of this, they were then returned to their quarters where they had the opportunity to take a brief shower. The water was cold, before making sure the dormitory and ablutions block were absolutely spotless. Quarters inspection came after that, and it was painstaking. Sir Carl, the wiry old knight who carried out the inspection, knew every trick in the book when it came to taking shortcuts and cleaning the dormitory, making your bed, and stowing your kit. The slightest infringement on the part of one of the 20 boys in the dormitory would mean all their kit would be scattered across the floor, their beds overturned, the rubbish bins emptied on the floor, and they would have to turn to and start again, in the time when they should have been having breakfast. As a consequence, new cadets only tried once to pull the wool over Sir Carl's eyes. Breakfast was nothing special. In fact, in Horace's opinion, it was downright basic. But if you missed it, it was a long, hard morning until the lunch hour, which, in keeping with the Spartan life in battle school, was only 20 minutes long. After breakfast, there were classes for 2 hours in military history, the theory of tactics, and so on. Then the cadets were usually required to run the obstacle course, a series of obstacles designed to test speed, agility, balance, and strength. There was a minimum time standard for the course. It had to be completed in under 5 minutes, and any cadet who failed to do so was immediately sent back to the start to try again. It was rare that anyone completed the course without falling at least once, and the course was littered with mud pools, water hazards, and pits filled with nameless but unpleasant matter whose origin Horace didn't want to think about. Lunch followed the obstacle course, but if you had fallen during the run, you had to clean up before entering the mess hall, another of those famous cold showers, and that usually took half the time set aside for the meal break. As a consequence, Horace's overwhelming impressions of the first week of battle school were a combination of aching muscles and gnawing hunger. There were more classes after lunch, then physical jerks in the castle yard under the eye of one of the senior year cadets. Then the class would form up and perform close order drill until the end of the school day, when they would have 2 hours to themselves to clean and repair gear and prepare lessons for the following day's classes. Unless, of course, someone had transgressed during the course of the day or in some way caused displeasure to one of their instructors or observers. in which case they would all be invited to load their packs with rocks and set out on a 12-kilometer run along a course mapped out through the surrounding countryside. Invariably, the course was nowhere near any of the level roads or tracks in the area. It meant running through broken, uneven ground, up hills and across streams, through heavily overgrown thickets where hanging vines and thick underbrush would claw at you and try to pull you down. Horace had just completed one such run. Earlier in the day, one of his classmates had been spotted in Tactics 1 passing a note to a friend. Unfortunately, the note was not in the form of text, but was an unflattering caricature of the long-nosed instructor who taught the class. Equally unfortunately, the boy possessed considerable skill as a cartoonist, and the drawing was instantly recognizable. As a result, Horace and his class had been invited to fill those packs and start running. He gradually felt himself pulling away from the rest of the boys as they labored up the first hill. Even after a few days, the strict regimen of the battle school was beginning to show results with Horace. He was fitter than he had ever been in his life. Added to that was the fact that he had natural ability as an athlete. Though he was unaware of it, he ran with balance and grace where the others seemed to struggle. As the run progressed, he found himself far in front of the others. He pounded on, head up, and breathing evenly through his nostrils. So far, he hadn't had much chance to get to know his new classmates. He had seen most of them around the castle or the village over the years, of course, but growing up in the ward had tended to isolate him from the normal day-to-day life of the castle and village. Ward children couldn't help but feel different from the others, and it was a feeling that the boys and girls with parents still living reciprocated. The choosing ceremony was peculiar to ward members only. Horace was one of 20 new battle school recruits that year, the other 19 coming through what was considered the normal process: parental influence, patronage, or recommendation from their teachers. As a result, he was regarded as something of a curiosity, and the other boys had so far made no overtures of friendship or even much attempts to get to know him. Still, he thought, smiling with grim satisfaction, he had beaten them all on the run. None of the others were back yet. He had shown them all right. The door at the end of the dormitory crashed open on its hinges, and heavy boots sounded on the bare floorboards. Horace raised himself on one elbow and groaned inwardly. Bryn, Alda, and Jerome were marching toward him between the neat rows of perfectly made beds. They were second-year cadets, and they seemed to have decided that their life's work was to make Horace's life miserable. Quickly, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, but not quickly enough. "What are you doing lying in bed?" Alda yelled at him. "Who told you it was lights out?" Bryn and Jerome grinned. They enjoyed Alda's verbal sallies. They weren't anywhere near as original, but they made up for it in their lack of verbal invention with a heavy reliance on the physical side of things. 20 push-ups, Bryn ordered. Now! Horace hesitated a moment. He was actually bigger than any of them. If it came to a confrontation, he was sure he could beat any one of them. But they were 3, and besides, they had the authority of tradition behind them. As far as he knew, it was normal practice for second year to treat first-year cadets like this, and he could imagine the scorn of his classmates if he were to complain to authority about it. Nobody likes a crybaby, he told himself as he began to drop to the ground. But Bryn had seen the hesitation and perhaps even the fleeting light of rebellion in his eyes. 30 push-ups, he snapped. Do it now! His muscles protesting, Horace dropped full length to the floor and began the push-ups. Immediately, he felt a foot in the small of his back, bearing down on him as he tried to raise himself from the floor. Come on, baby! It was Jerome now. Put a bit of effort into it. Horace struggled through a push-up. Jerome had developed the skill of maintaining just the right amount of pressure. Any more, and Horace would never have been able to complete the push-up. But the second-year cadet also kept pressing down on Horace started back down again. That made the exercise all the harder. He had to maintain the same amount of upward pressure as he lowered himself, otherwise he would be driven hard against the floor. Groaning, he completed the first, then started another. Stop crying, baby! Alda yelled at him. Then he moved to Horace's bed. Didn't you make this bed this morning? He yelled. Horace, struggling up again against the pressure of Jerome's foot, could only grunt in reply. What? What? Alda bent so that his face was only centimeters away. What's that, baby? Speak up. Yes, sir, Horace managed to whisper. Alda shook his head in an exaggerated movement. No, sir, I think, he said, standing upright again. Look at this bed. It's a pigsty. Naturally, the covers were a little rumpled where Horace had dropped across the bed. but it would have taken only a second or two to straighten them. Grinning, Bryn cottoned on to Alda's plan. He stepped forward and kicked the bed over on the side, spilling mattress, blankets, and pillows across the floor. Alda joined in, kicking the blankets across the floor. "Make the bed again!" he yelled. Then a light gleamed in his eye, and he turned to the next bed in line, kicking it over as well, scattering the bedclothes and mattresses as he had done to Horace's. "Make them all again!" he yelled, delighted with his idea. Bryn joined him, grinning widely as they tumbled to 20 beds, scattering blankets, pillows, and mattresses around the room. Horace, struggling still through the 30 push-ups, gritted his teeth. Perspiration ran into his eyes, stinging them and blurring his vision. "Crying, are you, baby?" he heard Jerome yell. "Go home and cry to Mummy, then." His foot shoved viciously into Horace's back, sending him sprawling on the floor. "Baby doesn't have a mummy," Alda said. "Baby's a ward brat. Mummy ran off." Jerome bent down to him again. "Is that right, baby?" he hissed. "Did Mummy run away and leave you?" "My mother's dead," Horace grated at them. Angrily, he began to rise, but Jerome's foot was on the back of his neck, thrusting his face against the hard boards. Horace gave up the attempt. "Very sad," Alda said, and the other two boys laughed. "Now clean this mess up, baby, or we'll have you run the course again." Horace lay, exhausted as the 3 older boys swaggered out of the room, tipping footlockers over as they went, spilling his roommate's belongings onto the floor. He closed his eyes as salt perspiration stung its way into them again. "I hate this place," he said, his voice muffled by the rough planks of the floor. Chapter 10. Time you learned about the weapons you'll be using," said Holt. They had eaten breakfast well before sunup, and Will had followed Holt into the forest. They had walked for about a half an hour with the ranger showing Will how to glide from one path of shade to the next as silently as possible. Will was a good student in the art of unseen movement, as Holt had already remarked, but he had a lot to learn before he reached ranger standard. Still, Holt was pleased with his progress. The boy was keen to learn, particularly when it was a matter of field craft like this. It was a slightly different matter when it came to the less exciting tasks, like map reading and chart drawing. Will tended to skip over details that he saw as unimportant until Holt pointed out to him with some acerbity. "You'd find these skills would become a little more important if you were planning a route for a company of heavy cavalry and forgot to mention that there's a stream in the way." Now, they stopped in a clearing and Holt dropped a small bundle that had been concealed beneath his cloak. Will regarded the bundle doubtfully. When he thought of weapons, he thought of swords and battle axes and war maces, the weapons carried by knights. It was obvious that this small bundle contained none of these. "What sort of weapons? Do we have swords?" Will asked, his eyes glued to the bundle. "A ranger's principal weapons are stealth and silence and his ability to avoid being seen," said Holt. "But if they fail, then you may have to fight." "So, then we have a sword?" Will said hopefully. Holt knelt and unwrapped the bundle. "No, then we have a bow," he said, and placed it at Will's feet. Will's first reaction was one of disappointment. A bow was something people used for hunting, he thought. Everyone had bows. A bow was more than a tool than a weapon. As a child, he had made his fair share of them himself, bending a springy tree branch into shape. Then, as Holt had said nothing, he looked more closely at the bow. This, he realized, was no bent branch. It was unlike any bow that Will had ever seen. Most of the bow followed one long curve like a normal longbow, but then each tip curved back into the opposite direction. Will, like most of the people of the kingdom, was used to the standard longbow, which was one long piece of wood bent into a continuous curve. This one was a good deal shorter. It's called a recurve bow," said Holt, sensing his puzzlement. "You're not strong enough to handle a full longbow yet, so the double curve will give you extra arrow speed and power, with a lower draw weight. I learned how to make one from the Temujai." "Who are the Temujai?" asked Will, looking up from the strange bow. "Fierce fighting men from the east," said Holt, "and probably the world's finest archers." "You fought against them?" "Against them and with them for a time," said Holt. "Stop asking so many questions." Will glanced down at the bow in his hand again. Now that he was becoming used to its unusual shape, he could see that it was a beautifully made weapon. Several shaped strips of wood had been glued together, and with their grains running in different directions. They were of different thicknesses, and it was this that achieved the double curve of the bow, as the different forces strained against each other, bending the limbs of the bow into a carefully planned pattern. Maybe, he thought, this really was a weapon after all. "Can I shoot it?" he asked. Halt nodded. "If you feel it's a good idea, go ahead," he said. Quickly, Will chose an arrow from the quiver that had been in the bundle alongside the bow and fitted it into the string. He pulled the arrow back with his thumb and forefinger, aimed at a tree trunk some 20 meters away, and fired. Whack! The heavy bowstring slapped into the soft flesh on the inside of his arm, stinging like a whip. Will yelled with pain and dropped the bow as if it were red hot. Already a thick red welt was forming on his arm. It throbbed painfully. Will had no idea where the arrow had gone, nor did he care. "That hurt," he said, looking accusingly at the ranger. Halt shrugged. "You're always in a hurry, youngster," he said. "That may teach you to wait a little next time." He bent to the bundle and pulled out a long cuff made of stiff leather. He slid it onto Will's left arm so that it would protect him from the bowstring. Ruefully, Will noticed that Halt was wearing a similar cuff. Even more ruefully, he realized that he had noticed this before but never wondered about the reason for it. "Now, try it again," said Halt. Will chose another arrow and placed it on the string. As he went to draw it back again, Halt stopped him. "Not with the thumb and forefinger," he said. "Not with the thumb and finger," he said. "Let the arrow rest between the first and second fingers on the string, like this." He showed Will how the notch at the butt end of the arrow, actually clipped to the string and held the arrow in place. Then he demonstrated how to let the string rest on the first joint of the first, second, and third fingers, with the first finger above the nock point and the others below it. Finally, he showed him how to allow the string to slip loose so that the arrow was released. "That's better," he said, and as Will brought the arrow back, continued, "Try to use your back muscles, not just your arms. Feel as if you're pushing your shoulder blades together." Will tried it, and the bow seemed to draw a little easier. He found he could hold it steadier than before. He fired again. This time he just missed the tree trunk he had been aiming for. "You need to practice," said Halt. "Put it down for now." Carefully, Will laid the bow down on the ground. He was eager now to see what Halt would produce next from the bundle. "These are Ranger's knives," said Halt. He handed Will a double scabbard like the one he wore on the left hand side of his own belt. Will took the double scabbard and examined it. The knives were set one above the other. The top knife was the shorter of the two. It had a thick, heavy grip made of series of leather discs that set one above the other. There was a brass crosspiece between the hilt and the blade, and it had a matching brass pommel. "Take it out," said Halt. "Do it carefully." Will slid the short knife from the scabbard. It was an unusual shape. Narrow at the hilt, it tapered out sharply, becoming thicker and wider for 3/4 of its length, to form a broad blade with the weight concentrated toward the tip. Then, a steep reverse taper created a razor-sharp point. He looked curiously at Halt. "It's for throwing," said the ranger. "The extra width at the tip balances the weight of the hilt, and the combined weight of the two helps drive the knife home when you throw it. Watch." His hand moved smoothly and swiftly to the broad-bladed knife at his own waist. He flicked it free from the scabbard, and in one smooth action sent it spinning toward a nearby tree. The knife thudded home into the wood with a satisfying thunk. Will looked at Halt, impressed with the ranger's skill and speed. "How did you learn how to do that?" he asked. Halt looked at him. "Practice." He gestured for Will to inspect the second knife. This one was longer. The handle was the same leather disc construction, and there was a short, sturdy crosspiece. The blade was heavy and straight, razor-sharp on one side, thick and heavy on the other. "This is in case your enemy gets to close quarters," said Halt. "Although if you're any sort of archer, he never will. It's balanced for throwing, but you can also block a sword stroke with that blade. It's made by the finest steelsmiths in the kingdom. Look after it and keep it sharp." "I will," the apprentice said softly, admiring the knife in his hands. "It's similar to what the Scandians call a sax knife," Halt told him. Will frowned at the unfamiliar name, and Halt went on to explain. "It's both weapon and tool. A sea axe originally, but over the years the words sort of slid together to become sax. The quality of the steel in ours is a long way superior to the Scandian ones." Will studied the knife more closely, seeing the faint blue tint in the blade, feeling the perfect balance. With its leather and brass hilt, the knife might be plain and functional in appearance, but it was a fine weapon, and Will realized far superior to the comparatively clumsy swords worn by Castle Redmont's warriors. Halt showed him how to strap the double scabbard to his belt so that his hand fell naturally to the knife hilts. Now, he said, all you have to do is learn to use them, and you know what that means, don't you? Will nodded his head, grinning. A lot of practice, he said. All right, that is that. Next chapter we'll go back to Horace. So it seems like we're going to be bouncing from the ward mates. So we've gotten Will, now then Horace, and back to Will, and then we'll go back to Horace. And I wonder eventually we'll get to Jenny and Alice and George maybe too. So all right, have a good day.